Black CEO kicked out of VIP seat for white passenger, froze when he quietly fired them all. A hush swept through the crowded cabin as Daniel Whitmore felt every eye shift toward him. The hum of the engines was drowned out by whispers, sharp, cutting, merciless. A flight attendant hovered above him, her smile stretched thin, her voice laced with irritation as she repeated the demand. "Sir, please surrender your seat, now." Daniel's fingers tightened around the armrest. He was not a man easily rattled, but this moment sliced deeper than he expected. Passengers leaned into the aisle, watching as if a spectacle had been staged for their entertainment. Some shook, their heads in disapproval. Others smirked, waiting for him to break. Behind the attendant, her supervisor loomed, arms folded, authority radiating like a weapon. "You're making this difficult, Mr. Whitmore. Don't embarrass yourself further. Just stand up." The words cut sharper than they should have. Embarrass himself? For sitting in the seat he had paid for? For daring not to bow his head when others expected silence? Daniel's heart pounded, but his voice carried steady. He raised his chin, his gaze unflinching, and let the answer fall into the charged air. "No, this seat is mine." Gasps echoed. Whispers multiplied. Somewhere a passenger muttered, "He'll regret this." And maybe he would. But Daniel had already decided. Whatever came next, he would face it standing his ground. Long before the flight that placed him in the center of humiliation, Daniel Whitmore had built a life shaped by quiet battles and uncompromising values. He was not born into privilege, nor did he inherit a golden ladder to success. His story began in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston, where cracked sidewalks and weathered homes carried the weight of struggle but also the resilience of ordinary people. Daniel's father had worked long hours as a factory technician, while his mother ran a small bakery that barely covered the bills. From them, Daniel absorbed two unshakable lessons: work hard and never let anyone strip away your dignity. These values became the silent compass that guided him as he stepped into the wider world. In school, Daniel was not the loudest or the most talented, but he was known for a steady calm that never wavered. When a group of older students mocked him for wearing hand-me-down shoes, he did not fight back with fists or cruel words. Instead, he simply stood tall, looked them in the eyes, and walked away. It was not defiance born of pride, but an instinctive refusal to bow to shame. That single act left a quiet mark on him. No one could dictate his worth. As he grew older, Daniel's ambitions stretched beyond his neighborhood. He wanted to create something of his own, not just for wealth, but for the independence it represented. After college, he started small. Just a single office, a few used desks, and a vision for a logistics company that would handle shipments with efficiency and fairness. The early days were brutal. Some clients dismissed him, assuming he lacked the experience or the network to compete with established names. Others tried to exploit his eagerness by forcing unfair terms. Daniel never exploded in anger, never resorted to desperation. Instead, he negotiated with steady composure, earning slow but undeniable respect. Years later, his company grew into a respected mid-sized firm with contracts across the state. But what made Daniel truly stand out was not just the balance sheet, it was the way he treated people. He knew the names of his employees, remembered their children's birthdays, and when someone struggled, he found ways to help without ever making them feel small. A janitor once said, "Working here feels like family because Mr. Whitmore sees us as human first." That philosophy was not born from corporate strategy, but from Daniel's personal creed. Respect, he believed, was not a luxury handed out selectively. It was the baseline of human interaction. Everyone deserved it, whether they were an executive or a server carrying drinks down an airplane aisle. There had been moments in his past where this principle was tested. At a business dinner years earlier, a wealthy associate dismissed a young waitress by snapping fingers at her. Daniel quietly placed his napkin on the table, looked the man in the eye, and said, "If you want to speak to her, you will use words, not gestures." The table went silent. The associate smirked in disbelief, but the waitress glanced at Daniel with a mix of shock and gratitude. That evening, the deal he was pursuing nearly slipped away, but Daniel did not regret it. To him, there was no profit worth the cost of degrading someone else. In another instance, during a company meeting, an employee nervously presented an idea while others whispered about how impractical it sounded. Daniel interrupted the murmurs, leaned forward, and said, "Let us hear him out fully. Every voice matters here." That employee's idea eventually became one of the company's most efficient cost-saving strategies. Moments like these, scattered across his life, painted the portrait of a man who carried dignity as both shield and sword. He was not a fighter in the traditional sense, but when pushed into a corner, he never surrendered his ground. His calm strength unsettled those who expected compliance, because Daniel's refusal was never loud. It was unshakable. This quiet. History explains why the events on the plane cut so deeply. To the passengers watching, it may have looked like a simple request from airline staff to give up his seat. But to Daniel, it was not just a matter of comfort or convenience. It was about something much larger. This was about being treated as less than, about being pushed aside for someone deemed more important, more deserving. He had faced such tests before in small ways, but now it was unfolding under the harsh gaze of strangers in a confined cabin thousands of feet above the ground. The whispers, the judgment, the subtle ridicule, each one pressed against his core values. Daniel knew he could give up his seat and avoid the tension, but that would mean betraying the very principles that had shaped his life. The audience on that flight did not know his history, the years of quiet battles and firm stands. But for Daniel Whitmore, this was not the first time he was asked to bend, and just like before, he chose to stand tall, even while seated. The plight, return to the present moment, was sharp, almost like waking from a dream. Daniel sat in his seat, still calm, but aware that the tension around him had thickened. The flight attendants had exchanged glances more than once, and now one of them approached with a practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Sir," she began, her voice polite yet carrying an undertone of insistence, "we are very sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your seat. We will need you to move." Daniel looked up, his face composed, his hands resting loosely on his lap. "I booked this seat weeks ago," he said in his steady voice. "I am comfortable here. What issue are you referring to?" The attendant faltered for a moment, but quickly recovered. "It is a matter of priority, sir. Someone else needs this seat. We have another seat available for you." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. And who decided my seat was less important?" His words were not confrontational, but they carried weight. The attendant hesitated before glancing over her shoulder. Another crew member joined her, this one a supervisor. She had the sharp tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Sir, I need you to cooperate. We cannot discuss the details, but this seat must be reassigned. Please gather your belongings and follow me." Around them, whispers began to spread. Some passengers smirked, amused by the sight of a man being challenged by authority. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that what was unfolding was not right, but unwilling to intervene. Daniel remained calm on the outside. His back was straight, his voice even. But inside, a storm brewed. He felt his dignity under attack. This was not about a cushion or legroom. It was about being pushed aside, as though his presence carried less value. He replied carefully, "I purchased this seat like every other passenger. I have followed every rule and shown respect. I am not refusing out of defiance, but I ask you, why should I move? Why is my right to remain here being ignored?" The supervisor's smile vanished. Her tone hardened. "Sir, I am not asking. I am telling you, if you do not comply, you will delay the flight for everyone." Laughter rippled from a few rows back. One man muttered just loudly enough, "Why make such a scene? It is only a seat." Another chuckled, shaking his head, as if Daniel was being unreasonable. Yet not all reactions were cruel. A young woman across the aisle lowered her phone, her eyes filled with quiet respect. An older gentleman near the window gave the slightest nod, a subtle gesture of solidarity. They recognized something deeper was happening, though they said nothing. Daniel's pulse quickened. He wanted to shout, to demand the fairness he had always stood for, but he remembered his father's words, lessons carved into him since youth. Dignity is not lost when others try to strip it from you. It is lost only when you surrender it yourself. Taking a steady breath, he stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. With quiet dignity, he reached for his bag and lifted it from under the seat. His face betrayed no anger, but his silence spoke volumes. The supervisor gave a curt nod, as though victory had been won. She gestured toward a narrow seat at the back of the plane. Daniel walked down the aisle, each step heavy, each whisper around him echoing in his ears. As he passed the row, the so-called VIP slid into the seat Daniel had vacated. The man's expression was smug, his body language radiating entitlement. The exchange was complete. A transaction of respect traded away in the open air of the cabin. Daniel sat in his new seat, tucked into the corner near the restroom. The putt. Space was smaller, the hum of the engine louder. For a long moment, he stared ahead, not really seeing the seat in front of him. A silence settled inside him, deeper than the cabin noise. And in that silence, realization struck. This was never about the seat. It was about respect. About whether dignity could be shuffled around, reassigned, and treated as disposable. Daniel knew in that instant that the humiliation he had endured would leave a mark far greater than the discomfort of his cramped new seat. Yet even in that painful moment, he held himself tall, because though they had moved his body, they had not bent his spirit. Daniel reached home late that night, but his mind was still trapped inside that plane cabin. The echo of mocking laughter and the cold expression of the supervisor replayed in his head again and again. Even when he tried to push it away, the memory kept pulling him back. For a man who had built his life on dignity and self-respect, this wound was deeper than he wanted to admit. His wife Clara was waiting at the dining table. The warm meal she had prepared filled the house with comfort, but Daniel's face carried a heaviness she noticed instantly. She did not ask at first. She simply watched as he sat down slowly, his shoulders weighed down as if the whole world had pressed itself upon him. Finally, she reached across the table and asked softly, "What happened, Daniel?" For a moment, Daniel stayed silent. Then, in a voice low but steady, he began to recount everything. The polite request that turned into an order, the mocking voices that spread through the cabin, the humiliation of being forced from his seat, and the silence he kept while strangers stared at him. Clara listened carefully, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on him. When he finished, she said nothing. She only placed her hand over his. That small act of comfort broke the wall Daniel had tried to keep strong all evening. "It was not about the seat," Daniel said, his voice firm now. "It was about the way they looked at me, as if my presence had no value. As if respect was something I had to earn by proving myself, when I have spent my life showing respect to others." Clara nodded. She knew her husband. She knew how deeply he valued fairness. She had seen him stand up for his employees when they were treated poorly, even at the cost of his own convenience. But this time, she sensed, was different. After dinner, when the house was quiet and Clara had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in his study. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The storm inside him grew louder. His inner voice repeated, "If I allow this, I compromise who I am." He thought about the lessons his father had once told him. A man is not measured by wealth, but by the respect he gives and demands in return. Daniel had built his company with those words as his guide. He treated his staff like partners, not servants. He remembered how he once walked into the server room late at night and saw his junior technician struggling with a tangled cable system. Daniel rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside him until the job was done. The young man had never forgotten that gesture. Respect to Daniel was never optional. Now, sitting in his quiet study, Daniel felt something shifting inside him. The humiliation on the plane had cut him deeply, but it had also awakened a realization. He was not powerless. The people who tried to belittle him did not know who he was or what quiet power he carried. Daniel's company provided IT infrastructure, services for several major airlines, their booking systems, passenger management tools, and even their data security relied heavily on his firm's technology. He had never thought much about it beyond business, but now he understood. He was not just another passenger in seat 14A. He was a man whose work kept planes flying smoothly, whose decisions affected thousands of journeys each day. A new kind of fire burned in him. He was not thinking of revenge. That was never his way. But he was thinking of principle. He knew he could not undo the humiliation of that flight, but he could decide how he would respond to it. That night, Daniel wrote in his leather-bound notebook, a habit he had kept since his early business days. On a clean page, he wrote in firm letters, "Never again will I allow anyone to strip me of dignity." Respect is not asked for. It is lived, demanded, and protected. As he closed the notebook, a calm strength filled his chest. This was his turning point. He would not carry the humiliation as a burden. He would carry it as fuel. Daniel knew one truth more clearly than ever before. Respect was not just a principle, it was his foundation. And no one, not even an airline filled with strangers, had the power to take that away. The humiliation from the flight still echoed in Daniel's mind, but he had learned long ago that real power did not always come from raising your voice. Sometimes the strongest answer was silence, followed by action. Daniel was not just any passenger. He was the man behind the invisible networks that kept several airlines alive. His company managed booking systems, maintenance schedules, passenger data, and even communication platforms. Without his services, flights could not run smoothly. But on that plane, no one had cared who he was. They had stripped him of dignity as if he were invisible. Now Daniel decided they would learn exactly who he was. At first, his moves were quiet. During routine contract renewals, he began shifting critical services away from the airline that had humiliated him. The changes were subtle, masked under new partnerships and cost-saving adjustments. On paper, everything looked ordinary. To an outsider, it appeared like simple business. But Daniel knew each step was part of something bigger. Weeks passed, and at first no one noticed. Planes still took off, passengers still boarded, and staff still smiled as though nothing had changed. But slowly the cracks began to appear. A booking system glitched in the middle of a busy morning rush, leaving dozens of passengers stranded at the counter. A baggage carousel froze for 20 minutes, scattering luggage in confusion. A flight was delayed because maintenance logs failed to upload on time. Each disruption seemed small, almost accidental, but together they created frustration and chaos. Inside the airline's offices, management scrambled to find answers. Emails were exchanged, urgent meetings were called, and supervisors demanded explanations. Yet no one could see the full picture. To them, it looked like a string of technical errors. To Daniel, it was justice unfolding. For every delay, every angry passenger shouting at staff, every late-night phone call to calm down furious executives, Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction. They had mocked him in public, treated him as less, but now the tables had turned. They were powerless, and he was the reason. Passengers complained loudly. "This airline is falling apart," one man shouted in an airport lounge after his flight was delayed for the third time. Another woman posted a video online of chaos at the gate, her voice trembling with anger. The company's reputation began to weaken, piece by piece. But Daniel never bragged, never gloated. He carried himself the same way he always had, calm, measured, composed. Outwardly, he was just another businessman going about his work. Inside, however, he carried the deep satisfaction of knowing that respect was being restored in silence. The irony was not lost on him. On that plane, they had robbed him of his seat, dismissing his worth as a man. But now, in offices and airports across the country, they were facing the consequences of dismissing him. His revenge was not loud or cruel. It was precise, calculated, and invisible. They had tried to humiliate him in front of strangers. Now, he humbled them before the entire world. And the best part, they still had no idea who was pulling the strings. The storm finally arrived. What had started as small cracks in the system grew into a flood the airline could not control. Across the country, passengers stood in long lines at crowded airports, frustrated and furious. Booking systems crashed in the middle of transactions. Flights were delayed for hours without explanation. Some flights were canceled altogether. Social media exploded with angry posts, tagging the airline and demanding answers. News channels picked up the chaos. Headlines flashed across the screen. National airline faces unprecedented IT failure. Thousands stranded, companies silent on root cause. The once proud airline, which had mocked Daniel without hesitation, was now struggling to survive under the weight of its own arrogance. Inside the airline's headquarters, panic filled the air. Meetings ran late into the night. Executives screamed at technicians, demanding solutions. But no matter what patch was applied, the problems returned. The truth was simple. They had lost the silent backbone of their system, and they had not even realized it until now. For Daniel, the irony was sharp. They had disrespected him in public, reducing his dignity in front of strangers. Now their humiliation was public, displayed in headlines and angry voices around the nation. One evening, as Daniel sat in his office, he received an email marked urgent. It was from the airline's CEO. The words were carefully chosen, polished with desperation. Dear Mr. Daniels, we have come to realize how crucial your company has been to our operations. We deeply regret the misunderstanding and the way you were treated. Please accept our most sincere apologies. We request an immediate meeting to resolve this matter and rebuild our relationship. We assure you of the highest respect moving forward. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in his calm eyes. He read the email once, then again. For a moment he allowed himself to remember that day at the airport. The sneers, the whispers, the dismissive look from the manager. The pain of standing there, stripped of dignity, while strangers judged him by his skin rather than his worth. Now, those same people who had dismissed him were begging for his attention. He could almost hear their panic in the polished words of the email. The next morning, a formal letter followed. This time, on official company letterhead. It carried the same message, but with even more urgency. They wanted him back. They needed him. But Daniel had already reached his turning point. He picked up the letter, holding it carefully. He read each line slowly, almost as if weighing the value of every word. But in the end, the decision was not hard. Respect was not a currency to be bought when convenient. Respect was the foundation of every relationship, personal or professional. And once broken, it could not be repaired by empty words. Later that day, Daniel called his assistant into the office. Draft a reply, he said in a calm, steady voice. His assistant nodded, waiting for the words. Daniel paused for a moment, then spoke clearly. Thank them for their message. But tell them our company has decided not to continue any partnership with them. Let them know that we wish them well. The assistant looked surprised but quickly began typing. Daniel leaned back in his chair once more, his face calm, almost serene. This was not revenge driven by anger. It was justice guided by principle. He knew the airline would suffer. He knew the headlines would only grow louder. But he also knew something more important. He had remained true to himself. And as he looked out of the tall glass window of his office, watching the city lights glow against the night sky, a quiet message formed in his heart. Respect once lost cannot be bought back. It was the lesson the airline had failed to learn. And it was the truth Daniel would carry with pride. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of Daniel's office building. The city outside was rushing, horns blaring, people moving, fast. But inside, everything felt calm. Daniel walked slowly through the polished halls of his company, his shoes tapping lightly against the floor. Employees looked up as he passed. Some nodded, others smiled warmly. A few even stood, greeting him with a respectful, "Good morning, Mr. Daniels." These gestures were small, but to Daniel they carried more weight than all the luxury seats on any airplane. They were real. They were genuine. As he reached the corner office, he paused by the window, looking out over the skyline. He thought about how far things had come. The airline that had once mocked him was now struggling, its reputation shaken, its losses growing. Meanwhile, his company stood tall, strong, and respected. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He was not proud because he had caused their downfall. He was proud because he had not let himself be broken. That night at the airport, when laughter filled the air, they tried to strip him of his dignity. But he had held on. He had chosen silence, patience, and quiet strength. And in the end, that strength had spoken louder than any words could. At dinner that evening, his wife looked at him across the table. "You seem lighter," she said gently, "almost at peace." Daniel smiled. "Because I know now, respect is not about where you sit. It is about who you are." He thought of the lesson hidden in his journey. A seat may seem small, a moment of humiliation may seem personal, but disrespect cuts deeper. It challenges identity, worth, and pride. And when respect is denied, even the strongest empires can fall. Daniel leaned back, the clinking of silverware and soft laughter of his family filling the room. He had not just defended himself. He had defended the very principle that every human being deserves dignity. As the night drew on, Daniel walked out into the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The city lights twinkled below like countless stars. He breathed deeply, his heart steady. "Power fades," he whispered to himself. "Wealth shifts, but respect, once lost, it can never be bought back." The screen fades to black. A seat may belong to anyone, but respect belongs only to those who give it, and those who refuse to live without it.